All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our last talk for the day. B-Sides, 5th anniversary. Everybody having a good time? Yeah. All right, awesome. How many people are continuing the week over at DEF CON? Awesome, awesome. We'll see you all there. Good times. All right, so for our last one here, we've got Dimitri fousekis. Beam me up, Scotty. Passwords in the Enterprise. And with that, I will turn it over to you, sir.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for being here. So as the title of the talk showing, it's Beam Me Up, Scotty, Passwords in the Enterprise. And basically, the talk's going to cover numerous failures and successes of what one can do when it comes to implementing, managing, controlling passwords in the enterprise. Just a little bit about me. So Dimitri fousekis is the name, if you didn't see it already. I go by the nickname of Rurapente, or Twitter account, Rurapente with a 0. I'm a pen tester at Telspace Systems in Johannesburg, South Africa. No lion is a pet, so I'll save you having to ask that. 13 years experience in IT, 10 plus in security-related domains, a member of Team Hashcat. And basically the reason for this talk is because companies are failing at implementing passwords. So by companies, I don't necessarily just mean those that we've seen breached when it comes to end user applications on the internet. I'm talking about actual companies, their internal systems, and their staff. So we're going to look at how we can fix that. If we go straight in there and have a look at why we're focusing on enterprises, it comes down to the fact that an enterprise has some core differences from a small company. A large company's got some core differences they can't do without, which results in them making decisions which affect the passwords they have and how they manage and how they store those. So if we look at the large company, the risk appetite tends to be low. So their decisions have to be made and taken with a risk appetite that cannot really grow that much. Now, I don't necessarily mean the risk of having your passwords exposed. I mean everything, operational risk, financial risk. Those decisions impact what these companies can do, whereas your small company doesn't have a very high risk appetite. They do still have one, but they don't need to make decisions as quickly and move as fast as a large company does in order to satisfy their risk. If we look at the common way that passwords are managed in enterprise, obviously it's usually in some kind of a directory. If it's Microsoft-based, it's Active Directory. Whereas in the smaller company, smaller environment, it's a standalone directory. The one domain controller services everything that company does. Whereas in the large enterprise, your AD is integrated maybe to other ADs, or perhaps it's integrated to other systems like enterprise directory services, etc. So you begin to take what's just a password and you begin to move that basket you've got of passwords into other segregated and distributed systems. So that results in multiple password stores, from databases to, hopefully it's not used, but we do see it, text files, Active Directory, other directories, perhaps Oracle directory services, whereas there's few password stores in a smaller company. Then when it comes to the support within a large company, we have multi-tiered support in an enterprise. So you have Bob, the desktop admin, maybe you have John, who's the server admin, you have enterprise admins, you have network admins, and so forth. Whereas the smaller company only has to worry about one guy that has access to these systems and his password. Whereas in the multi-tiered structure, you have a server administrator and a desktop administrator who maybe have domain admin accounts on both sides. Then you have additional issues when you introduce the complex software and design and architecture that a large company has. This all has an impact on the passwords they manage, the rules, how they use them, and what they do with them. Again, a smaller company tends to be more off the shelf and slightly more simple in the architecture that they have. Lastly, of course, you have a broad range of people simply by the size of the company. Broad range of cultures, so you have a broad range of password candidates. It can span countries, it can span cities, cultures, all sorts of types of education, and so forth. Whereas a smaller company has a less range of people, and thus a smaller amount of password candidates, and what makes those up. So taking this into account now and looking at what differentiates the large company versus the small one, let's look at 5 ways that these large enterprises fail when it comes to password implementation. The first one, of course, is, and you may not guess this initially, but it's the password policy. Okay? So the password policy, the exact thing that you would expect to secure passwords in an enterprise, is often the first one that actually is the issue. And there's many reasons for that. It's not enforced, is a common one. It's too difficult. So when you sat down and put the password policy together, it makes sense. We want this, we want it managed this way, it has to be audited that way. Then you push that out to multiple environments, multiple tiers, support, administration. They get this password policy and they can't do their day-to-day work with it. So it begins to start changing and failing, and so it becomes completely negated. The next reason companies fail is when the password policy is starting to show signs of not working too well, and there's the odd breach of a password within the company, they jump to the reflex action of, you now have to choose passwords that look like this, right? So it's got to be long, it's got to be complex, completely overreacted. We don't want to breach, all the users have to do this. And then what happens is the users are told now they have to pick these passwords, and they do that. And when you take a stroll through where these people work, what do you see? Post-its on the screen with the password, little notes. One company I went to, someone actually had all their passwords written down on a piece of paper for all the systems, including the photocopier. So they went to the photocopier, did their work there, forgot the paper, and walked off. So you have this piece of paper that's got usernames Bob, and then finance systems password is this one, HR is this one, and so forth. So that's what happens primarily when you go the other direction and you become too complex with what the requirements are that you're giving your staff. So that fails as well. Then you have the $50,000 magic policy enforcement software. So the company goes out, purchases software that is designed to enforce the policy, right? So when the user tries to pick a password that is not strong enough, not long enough, not good enough, it comes back and says, no, you can't choose this, you have to choose something stronger. That works up to an extent. Then you get up to the people who actually control things, domain administrators, server administrators. They don't have time for this. Firstly, most of them probably have uninstalled it because they don't want this extra piece of software watching or collecting data about what they're doing. Secondly, they can simply go onto the Active Directory domain controller or directly into SQL or MySQL, wherever the password's stored, and put their own one in there. This software is not going to stop that from happening unless you go back and audit. But again, from enforcing the policy, there's so many ways around it that in the end it becomes negated. So that's also a point of failure there as well. Then what some companies do is they go the two-factor authentication route. So we implement two-factor authentication. Now, the fact that the user's passwords are very bad doesn't matter because they've got this little token. And this little token or text on their mobile phone or whatever it is the answer. And unfortunately, it creates a bit of a false sense of security for various reasons. Firstly, in a large enterprise, it's very difficult to have two-factor authentication on every single system. Some are just simply not built to support it. So what do you land up having? You have this system on this side that supports and integrates to your two-factor authentication services, being very strong. But here you can't use it. So that business or that department in the company is allowed to continue because they have to work without two-factor auth. Again, the password is still insecure. It still isn't a good password. Hashing algorithms are still insecure. They still aren't good. So you're just back in the same place because when someone wants to breach the environment, they'll simply take the easiest route, and the two-factor didn't do anything for what the passwords were that the users had. Then the other route is to distribute it all. So you go out with as many Active Directories for HR, for the logins for the gate downstairs, for the canteen, you name it, there's a database for it. Again, this doesn't actually really work very well because the majority of users, firstly, are going to use the same password everywhere. Okay? It's the same company, so in their mind, same entity, and thus the same password will be used. Secondly, it still doesn't help the user choose a stronger password. It just means that there's more of them lying around. In fact, it makes it worse because if you're going to do an audit, you've now got this huge distributed environment which you have to try and work with. So those were the 5 5 points, major points where companies are failing. Large enterprises are failing when it comes to implementing and securing passwords in their environment. Now you'll notice we're focusing specifically on passwords. We're not too much focused on the identity, what they're using to manage the user identity, how they identify a user, because it's a password related talk, so we're focusing on the passwords. And one more place where companies find it extremely difficult for passwords is in SOA environments, service-oriented architecture. And the reason for that is because SOA is great for business. It came along and said, take all these distributed environments you've got in systems, drop SOA in the middle of them all, and everything's going to work perfectly. And to an extent, it does empower a large enterprise to do that. But unfortunately, from a password perspective, it actually made things a bit worse. And the reason for that is because you had systems that simply cannot use some authentication mechanisms, right? You may have a directory with usernames and passwords here. This system sitting on the other side of your SOA environment cannot integrate to it. It does not know what to do with that information. So the quickest route to fixing that companies did was embedding user credentials into SOAP messages going to this other system. So you have a nice strong password here. Your message comes into the SOA environment. SOA says, well, this system doesn't support it. So I'll use this magical username and password for everybody and push that onto the other service. And again, you have passwords now being used which are insecure, crossing these environments and these systems. And in some cases, the same password is used going up and down. The other reason, too, is when it comes to actually what the passwords are. Some companies have tried to go very strong. They've implemented strong versions of the SHA algorithm or other algorithms that produce very strong hashes, and then discovered that in a SOA environment where there's so much switching and so much work happening, they simply couldn't cope with the actual transactions going through. Because if you remember, the whole point of SOA within a company is to do the business work. It's not there just for IT, it's not there for security either. It's there to do the business work. In the end, it's paying bills. So if an algorithm is so strong that you're pushing thousands of transactions through per second through your SOA environment and it cannot cope, well, what do? They fall back to the faster ones, like SHA-1, like MD5. And then these policies, as I mentioned, these strong AD policies that you have in your directory are all negated by the fact that your systems which can support these types of integration are fed simple usernames and passwords, almost as if it was a token type of authentication just to make it work. So you have a failure in this environment as well. The other thing that is done often too is that companies assume that because the password is in the format of a hash, it's now secure to transmit over your network. Of course, that's not the case. In fact, it's completely opposite from that case. So that's a mistake that's often done as well, is you don't build enough security on top of your SOA transport when you're using these hash passwords. Again, makes it very easy for exposure to get those passwords out and to start to crack them. The next issue in the enterprise is when good admins go bad. And unfortunately, it's not necessarily a finger pointing at those who have administrative roles in a company, your domain admins, your network admins, but you need to keep in mind that these are the people who have to keep this environment going, right? Security is not in the forefront. The passwords are not in the forefront. What they want to make sure of is that this critical system that this company needs is running and it's going, because if it's not, well, they'll be finding a job somewhere else. So the more pressure these people have, the more shortcuts they take. they begin to bypass security policies, password policies. I don't have time to figure out a strong password. I'll use password 123 and I'll change it as soon as I'm done. Then the next crisis comes along and that just sits there until 2 years down the line when someone gets in, gets that hash, and has a simple time obtaining it. So a company needs to understand the server, domain, network administrator role and empower that person to choose stronger passwords. Otherwise, you're just back in the same boat. You will have strong enforcement, you'll have strong policies, good software, but the guys on the back end have the ability to bypass that simply because they don't understand why they should make it stronger. Now, some of you will remember roughly in January, I started sending out tweets and messages on RC on a survey to collect information from those who work in enterprise environments about what passwords mean to them, how they actually feel about passwords, what does it do in their everyday lives. And we'll have a look at some of the statistics that were collected there now. Starting with the first one was, how many passwords do you have to remember? And the clear highest one there is 6 to 10 passwords. So the average person in the street has to remember 6 to 10 passwords in their enterprise environment, right? So that's quite a lot. And what that tells us is that it looks like most enterprises are going for the distributed, segregated environments. HR has its own passwords. Finance systems, its own passwords. The proxy server to get internet breakout, that's got its own one. So companies are relying on that to try and keep it separate so that if a breach occurs, obviously it's kept in one place. The issue, of course, is that password reuse is going to come up every single time in these environments. Here's an interesting one. Do you use a password manager? This tells us that it doesn't seem to be very well used in enterprise environments, password managers. Most people probably have it on their home PC, or on their phones, but when it comes to being an enterprise environment, they don't have a password manager. And there's two ways to go with this. Some companies will say, no, we don't want that. All the eggs on one basket, one password protecting it. It's easy to gain access to that, but as we've seen with other talks at this con, there's ways to protect against that. And there's ways to ensure that your password manager actually gives you some kind of positive output. An interesting one here, which password is the most secure? Right? I'm not sure if you can see the text underneath there. Thankfully, no one said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. No one said password with a capital P and a 0. Someone thought a date was a secure password. The phrase seemed to get the highest points. This is a secure password. It's a phrase with mixed case, which is quite interesting to see as well. It is the longest one there, which also may have been a reason why it was chosen as well. Moving on from there, only special characters didn't really score that well. And quite scarily, # password 123 with a 0 and a capital P scored quite high as well. Again, from a rules-based perspective, when you're going to crack these passwords, especially the last one, it's not exactly very secure from that perspective. Phrases also up for negotiation about how secure they are. I'm not going to comment on that, but again, it's interesting to see though what users in an environment, enterprise environment, think makes a secure password for them. So let's look at how we can do it the right way. What points can we have to consider when it comes to managing passwords in an enterprise to keep it secure, to do what we can to stop passwords being breached, and when they are breached, to make sure that then it's not easy to crack them. The first one, and I mentioned this in my talk at PasswordsCon last year, and a few faces showed some concern. Hopefully that's changed now, is to audit your own passwords. Now, yes, when you say this to someone who's not in this environment, they're going to be like, what? You want us to hand over our entire password database to someone to hack it, crack it, and then give us back all the plain text and say this is what's wrong with it? Well, yes, that's what I'm saying, is to do that, because only then will you know what your users are actually thinking from a password perspective. Someone brought out interestingly too during this con that when you do a password audit, it helps the company identify where the weaknesses are in the password policy as well. So again, there's many benefits to doing that. And finally, you can also trigger your password resets. So you do an audit, and you then say, well, the following 10 user accounts had weak passwords, we're forcing them to reset. Right? You don't have to tell them why. And there's many ways to secure this. We're not saying put your password out on the internet and ask someone to go and crack it. The same people that you're trusting to manage the security within your company would be the ones who would be doing this kind of work. Next one is to associate the password to data ownership. Now, how many users do you think in a company understand the correlation between their password and the data they work with every single day? Very few, right? Password is just this thing which comes up and irritates me every time I try and do my job. That's what's in the user's mind. So educating users to understand that the password is directly linked to their work, to what they're doing, to the data they're responsible for, helps them to begin to grasp why that password needs to be secure, instead of just the first thing that they can type in there. Enforce the password policy. So again, spend less time actually developing the password policy, because you can talk about that for years, and find ways to enforce it. And these two ways we've seen with doing password audits or educating users to own the passwords, these all filter down into the password policy. So there's software you can use, there's the education, and there's the user of these passwords themselves. Help them understand what a password is, what makes it up, the semantics around it, so that they grasp what it is that they're creating. Here's one no one in finance is going to like, but it's true. You need more power from a SOA environment or a system environment to implement stronger algorithms, especially on transactional sites, which are going to be processing and using the processor to constantly work with these highly secured hashes. Many companies turn away from this, saying it's too expensive, but I'm pretty sure if you went back and asked some of the companies in the last five years who were breached and had MD5s or SHA-1 because it was nice and fast, if they would have spent an extra few $1,000s to have made it a stronger one, still keep up with what speed they required, they're all going to say yes. So that's something to keep in mind from a company perspective as well. Again, hashes are not transport layer security. And we see this so often in companies. We don't need SSL because all we're doing is sending authentication data, and it's hashed, the password's hashed, so it's secure. Okay? I think if anything, this kind of shown us that this isn't the case. So transport layer security must be added on top of whatever hashes are being passed, regardless of whether they're weak hashes, strong hashes, salted, unsalted, etc. So these points are what some companies are doing. Some still need to progress to this kind of maturity. They're stuck a bit in the software is going to fix it all for me environment. But as one makes progress, so these passwords will become secure and the output of them will begin to grow. So that's it from my side. I'll take some questions now if anybody has.
Have a mic back here for anybody who wants to do some questions. We are actually pretty ahead on time. Quarter till was our stop time here, so we got about 15 minutes for a little Q&A. Real quick round of applause here. Everybody enjoyed the talk, hopefully. All right, Dimitri. Questions for Dimitri? Anybody? Hands. Someone's got to have some questions. We got 15 minutes to fill here.
What was the most secure password on that graph that you showed?
Go back to the graph quickly. That one. Well, I would say it wasn't the most. I would say the most secure password isn't on there. Specifically, we didn't choose one that would be so obvious that people would say, well, this looks the most complex. The idea of this was actually to try and get you, the people completing the survey, to try and calculate in their minds, based on how I pick a password, which one would I think is be the most secure. It's not too far from being correct. I would say the password phrase, maybe with extra length and extra characters thrown onto it, would have been quite strong. But as it is here, I wouldn't say that any of these would be something I'd recommend anyone sets as a password. Yeah, over here. This one? Here?
Could you explain the axes, what they mean?
Oh, okay, sorry, I see what you mean. So based on the results of the entire survey, there was the percentage who said that they would use a password manager, right? So 100 plus are those that actually chose multiple password managers as the one that they were busy using, right? So the survey responses actually had the password manager names listed, as well as those which weren't listed as another, and then specifically, I don't use a password manager. So that's what the graph is. That's what the graph is based on.
So you're saying that some people said they used over 100 password managers?
Which no, that's the number of people, right? So 1 to 10%. Okay, sorry, I see what you're saying. 1 to 10% used under 10% of the password managers, right? 10 to 20% of the users, and so on and so forth, going up. I should have actually changed the labels there to explain it a bit better. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Yeah.
Do you know of any enterprise password managers specifically built for enterprise?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Do you know of any enterprise-grade password managers?
Enterprise grade password managers was the question.
Yeah, I don't know anyone selling it as an enterprise-grade password manager. That would be interesting to see because most of them have centralized storage of the password database. So you could potentially, on your own, create it, depending on where the store is. But I haven't seen anyone actually selling it as a password manager, apart from companies who've got plugin software for Windows, especially to enforce password policies. Those tend to also suggest the password that the user can use. I'd say that's about as close as I've seen to a password manager. I haven't seen any of them actually try and store it for you and manage it ongoing, though. Yeah.
Sorry. Would you actually recommend an enterprise password manager? Like,
if it were properly implemented, yeah, I would recommend an enterprise password manager, especially for enterprises who are still in a position where they've had to distribute all their password storage out, depending on what the system is and what the password store is. Especially, for example, if that enterprise password manager said that you cannot reuse the passwords, it would be quite great to see, because then the user would definitely have 6 different passwords, one very strong one to manage it, to move on, so forth. Kind of similar to single sign-on, but single sign-on also has some flaws. It isn't exactly password management in itself.
You were looking for a recommendation.
no recommendation. I asked if
Would I recommend that a company do that? Yeah.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Questions?
Before we say a funny goodbye, as the founder and main organizer of PasswordsCon, I want to say thank you for everyone coming to the conference, to all the speakers and our sponsors, and of course B-Sides and anybody else. I can also tell you now that this big secret is out of the bag. Twitter is now flowing with messages. John McAfee is the secret keynote speaker, and the information is